As we discussed in Semester 1, one of the most significant differences between composing music for film and composing absolute music is structure. Absolute music, whether it's a pop song or a classical symphony, uses structures that are based on long-established and musically coherent forms such as AABA form or sonata allegro form. When writing absolute music, the composer has the freedom to work with these forms according to their artistic vision and with the knowledge that the structure will feel balanced and familiar to listeners. But as we've seen, composing music for visual media requires a very different approach. The structure of a film or television scene is fixed and unchanging, which requires that the music be flexible and adaptable to the narrative's demands. The music must start and stop at predetermined points and align with and respond to the emotional beats of the story, emphasizing key moments and transitions along the way. In essence, there are two completely separate structures: the visual and narrative structures of the movie and the structure of the music. Our role as composers is to seamlessly align the flexible music structure with the inflexible movie structure. Last week, we went through the process of defining the structure of a color movie and then creating a matching music structure using time signature and tempo changes. I've transferred that session from Logic Pro to Digital Performer, which is the DAW that I use for composing, but otherwise everything is the same. The measure numbers are here along the top. The gray vertical lines are bar lines. These are the markers we placed at each color transition. You can see the time signature changes here, and I have the movie tucked over here. Finally, these lavender bars indicate tempo changes. By spending the time and thought to create the music structure before we start composing, we've made our composing job much, much easier. We've essentially created the musical equivalent of a coloring book. The markers are the outlines of the drawing, and your job is to color those in with music. How you do that depends on the scene, the style of music, and how you like to work. The composing process is different for every composer. You might be someone who likes to improvise on the piano while watching a scene and adjust and rework sections afterwards. You may like to work your way through an entire cue using a single instrument and then go back and flesh out the arrangement. You might compose one section at a time, fully orchestrating that section as you do. You might even like to improvise on your instrument away from the movie in order to collect ideas that you later fit into the music structure. And if you're working on a longer project, you probably want to spend multiple days coming up with thematic material that you will develop and adapt into your composition. There is no one right way to score, as long as the end result provides the greatest and most appropriate support for the scene and overall narrative as possible. When coming up with your musical ideas, one thing to consider is the distance between your major sync points. If the major sync points are very close together, such as you might find in a 30-second commercial, the basic chord changes may line up with the sync points. For scenes where the major sync points are 8 to 16 measures apart, you might write something like an AABA structure, extending and lining up each section to correspond with the major sync points. And for scenes where the major sync points are 16 to 32 measures or more apart, you may get through entire chord progressions within each segment and change to completely new sections of music at the sync points. So, let's begin. Looking at our structure, we can see that we have 4 bars of music for the color blue, 4 bars plus an extra 2 beats for the color purple, 5 bars for the color red, and 3 bars for the color yellow, though it's important to note that we want to end our music cue so that any sustained notes or reverb are completely finished and silent just before the out marker. That probably means we really only have something like 2 bars of music because we'll have to reserve that 3rd bar for the notes to hold and fade out. The structure of this color movie closely resembles a typical musical structure such as AABA with 4-bar phrases instead of 8-bar phrases, so that's what I'm going to write. We won't be able to write perfectly even 4-bar phrases, but that's okay. We can compose our music to fit and sound natural within the given structure. To start, I've written a simple piano progression. Here's how it would sound as a piece of absolute music with regular 4-bar phrases. I'll start recording this into the DAW. The first marker pair is 4 measures, and that works perfectly for our first A phrase. The second marker pair is 4 measures plus an extra 2 beats, which is an irregularity we'll have to deal with. So let's just put in the first 2 A phrases for now. I'll quantize the part so that it sounds a little more polished. Quantizing is a function of your DAW that moves the selected notes to the closest grid lines. You can set the quantization grid to any note value, and you should always select the smallest note value of whatever it is that you played. My piano piece consists of nothing shorter than 1/8 notes, so I'll set the quantization grid to 1/8 notes. I typically don't quantize parts like this 100%, but instead use something like 85 or 90%. That means that the notes will be moved close to the grid lines, but not exactly. This sounds a little more human and natural. For now, I'll skip over the 2/4 bar and lay in my B phrase between the third pair of markers. This section is 5 measures instead of 4, so I'll leave that 5th measure empty for now. For the final pair of markers, there are only 2 full bars available, not 4, so there's no way to fit in a full A phrase. I'll have to come up with something different for that. For now, I'm going to leave that section empty and fill in the 2 gaps at bars 9 and 14. The first gap, bar 9, is a 2/4 bar, meaning a bar with 2 beats. So I'll need to extend the current A phrase by 2 beats. Since we've been using a repeating A phrase, you might be tempted to just go back to the beginning of the phrase and use that first chord. However, you should never start a phrase if you do not have enough time to complete it. It will almost always sound artificially cut off and unmusical. This second marker pair has enough room for 1 complete phrase, but not 2. A much better tactic is to think of a way to naturally extend the existing phrase to make it 2 beats longer. This type of solution is not that common in absolute music, but is quite prevalent in scoring. As a composer for audiovisual media, you need to regularly come up with methods of extending and shortening phrases so that they sound natural but adhere to the given structure. In general, there are 2 ways to musically deal with extra or too few bars and beats. You can hide them so that they are not noticeable to the viewer at all, or feature them, composing in a way as to musically set up the phrase that follows. Since this music is front and center, that's the route I'll take with this. With that in mind, I'll extend the phrase in a way that pulls us into the downbeat of the next chord with drive and intention. And by the way, as you listen to that, you may have thought to yourself that you would have done something similar, or you may have thought that you have no idea how to come up with a phrase extension and you never would have come up with something similar. And that's okay. The beauty of having your markers in place and using them to decide where to start your phrases means that structurally, your music will work as needed. Now it's just a matter of how musically you're able to extend or shorten your phrases. That skill can take time to develop, and you'll get better at it the more you do it. At some point, it'll be second nature. So just do your best, experiment, and actually try out any ideas you think might work, and the rest will sort itself out. For the empty measure 14, we'll also need to extend the phrase, but this time by a full measure. In the original composition, the 4th measure of this B phrase contained 2 chords that created tension that was then resolved when we moved to the final A phrase. So I'll just stretch that tension so that it happens over 2 measures instead of 1. Here's the before. And here's the after. The final marker pair will hold our ending phrase, and it consists of only 2 full measures. Remember, I need to leave some space for the music to sustain and fade out. So, a good solution might be to start with the A phrase chords, but double the rate of the chord changes, and rewrite the second half so that it ends strongly and definitively. Here's the before. And here's the after. Let's listen to the entire piece as it stands now. This works well and fits the structure, but I'm not feeling enough of a change at each color transition, especially when we change from blue to purple and we just hear that same A phrase repeated. So we need to do something to address that. In Module 3, when talking about major sync points, I said that you'll usually want the music to make a noticeable shift at these moments. Here are just some of the options that can work to accomplish that. Start a new phrase, such as a B section. Add or take away instruments or parts to increase or decrease the density of the music. Change the melodic line or change the primary melodic instrument. Change the chords behind the melody. Modulate to a new key. Increase or decrease the rhythmic subdivisions. Change to a completely new piece of music. Pause or stop the music. We are already utilizing the first option, start a new phrase such as a B section, because we're using the major sync points to delineate our AABA structure. And the change from our second A phrase to the B phrase and back to the altered A phrase does sound more noticeable than the 2 repeating A phrases. What we really need to add is something when that second A phrase starts at measure 5. 2 options that would work great here are add or take away instruments or parts to increase or decrease the density of the music, and increase or decrease the rhythmic subdivisions. So, we can try adding a second piano part at the start of our second A phrase, and we can also increase the rhythmic subdivisions by playing 16th notes instead of 8th notes. In other words, play something twice as fast as what the first piano part is playing. I'll add this second piano part higher up on the keyboard so that it doesn't conflict with what we already have. I'll also keep that line going for the B phrase. The last thing I'd like to try is to add a tempo retard to the end of the piece so that the last couple of chords slow down. We don't have much time available before the out marker, but I'll see if there's room for even a slight decrease in tempo. I just have to make sure that the music tail, including reverb, doesn't extend past the out marker, and also that there's not dead silence for more than 1/4 of a second or so before the out marker. The music needs to fit neatly and completely within the movie. Let's watch the finished piece against picture. So you can see that all we did was musically fill in the empty spaces between each marker pair, making sure that new phrases and additions always started right at each marker. And I want to point out that although these markers only indicated solid colors, they could just as easily have denoted changes in emotion or action, and the composing process would have been the same. Write appropriate music for each section and craft the phrases and arrangement to align with the major sync points. There's an additional type of writing that we also need to look at, and that's when your music has no tempo or rhythm to it at all.